How this police dog saved the day, unbelievable. The city buzzed with life, the hum of traffic blending into the distant wail of sirens. Pedestrians weaved through the maze of streets, their conversations punctuated by the occasional bark of a street vendor or the squeal of tires on asphalt. Amid this chaos, Max, a seasoned German Shepherd K9 officer, stood steady, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. To most, the streets were a whirlwind of sights and sounds. To Max, they were a symphony of scents and emotions. He caught the faint tang of fear on a passerby, the nervous energy of someone late for work. A whiff of roasted peanuts drifted from a nearby stall. Beneath it all, there was the unmistakable scent of Jake, his handler and partner, a familiar blend of leather, soap, and determination. Max's world was layered and vivid, his keen nose and ears unraveling stories the human eye could never see. Jake crouched beside Max, his hand resting lightly on the dog's shoulder. "Another day in paradise, buddy," he said, his voice calm but tinged with weariness. Max turned his head, his amber eyes meeting Jake's. The unspoken bond between them was stronger than words. Jake chuckled softly, scratching behind Max's ears. "You're the best partner I've ever had, you know that," he murmured. The German Shepherd nudged Jake's hand in response, his tail wagging faintly. For years they had worked side by side, navigating the dangers of the city. Jake often joked that Max had better instincts than the entire precinct combined, but it wasn't a joke, not really. Max wasn't just a dog, he was family, a partner Jake trusted with his life. As they walked back to their patrol car, Max's ears perked, his stride faltering. The memory hit him like a wave, a dark alley, the echo of gunfire, the scent of blood. He had been too late that day, unable to save the officer pinned under a collapsing wall. The guilt lingered, an ache that drove him forward, pushing him to be faster, smarter, better. Jake seemed to sense it. He paused, kneeling in front of Max. "Hey," he said softly, "that wasn't your fault, Max. We both did everything we could." Jake's voice was steady, but his eyes held the weight of the same memory. Max pressed his head against Jake's chest, the warmth of his partner's heartbeat grounding him. Whatever had happened in the past, he had a job to do now. The radio crackled to life, shattering the moment. "All units, we've got a 1031 at First National Bank. Suspected armed robbery in progress. Hostages reported." Jake's expression hardened, his hand instinctively gripping the radio. "This is Unit 27, en route," he replied. Max felt the shift immediately. Jake's pulse quickened, and his usually steady voice carried a subtle tremor. In the car, the siren wailed, red and blue lights cutting through the city's haze. "You ready, Max?" Jake glanced at his partner as the car swerved through traffic. Max let out a low bark, his tail stiff with focus. But beneath his calm demeanor, he caught something on the wind, a faint metallic scent laced with adrenaline. Something about this mission felt different, more dangerous. As the car raced toward the bank, Max shifted restlessly in his seat. His ears twitched, picking up sounds no human could hear. The distant hum of engines, hurried footsteps, a faint whimper. Jake noticed and frowned. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his grip tightening on the wheel. Max growled softly, his nose pressed to the window. Jake exhaled, trusting his partner's instincts. "I hear you. Let's be ready for anything." The tension mounted as they approached the scene. Police cars were scattered around the bank's entrance, their lights reflecting off the glass facade. Officers moved in controlled chaos, securing the perimeter and strategizing their next move. Max leaped from the car, his muscles taut as he scanned the area. The air was thick with desperation. Fear from the hostages, aggression from the robbers, and the electric charge of danger. Jake knelt beside Max, adjusting the dog's harness. "We've got this," he said quietly, looking into Max's eyes. There was no doubt, no hesitation, just a shared understanding that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Max barked once, sharp and confident. Together, they turned toward the chaos, ready to meet the storm. The streets erupted in chaos, a cacophony of panicked voices and screeching tires filling the air. Civilians sprinted away from the towering bank, some clutching loved ones, while others yelled warnings into the sea of confusion. Red and blue, lights flashed rhythmically, casting an ominous glow over the faces of police officers huddled around their vehicles. Inside the building, chaos had taken another form. Barked orders echoed through the marble halls as masked robbers waved their guns, herding hostages into a corner like cattle. One man cried out, only to be silenced by a threatening glare. The hostages, huddled together, trembled under the weight of their fear. As another police car screeched to a halt, Max leaped out, his movements precise and calculated. His ears twitched, catching every sound, while his sharp eyes scanned the area. Beside him, Jake, his handler, approached the commanding officer. "What's the situation?" Jake's voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency in his tone. "The robbers are armed to the teeth," the officer replied grimly. "They've got at least 10 hostages. No demands yet, but they're getting agitated. We're running out of time." Jake nodded, glancing at Max, who stood motionless, his gaze locked on the bank. "We'll handle it." Max pressed close to Jake's side, sensing the tension rolling off him. Jake reached down and gave Max's head a brief pat, more for his own comfort than the dog's. Nearby, the officers were engaged in a heated debate. "Sending the K9 in is too risky," one of them argued. "What if they spot him? It could set them off." Jake's jaw tightened as he listened. His eyes drifted to Max, who stared back at him with unwavering confidence. "You trust him, don't you?" the commanding officer asked softly. Jake hesitated for a moment, then crouched down beside Max. "You're ready for this, aren't you, buddy?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Max leaned into Jake's touch, his eyes steady and calm, conveying a silent message. "I can do this." "All right," Jake said, rising to his feet. "Let's go." Slipping through a side entrance, Max moved like a shadow, his body low to the ground. Every sound was amplified in his ears, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the click of a gun safety being flipped off. The scent of fear hung heavy in the air, mingled with the sharp tang of metal and gunpowder. He rounded a corner, his movements precise, and froze. A masked man was patrolling the hallway, his steps uneven and hurried. Max pressed himself against the wall, waiting for the perfect moment. When the robber turned his back, Max darted forward, slipping through the gap undetected. The scent of something sharp and metallic pulled Max further into the building. It wasn't the usual smell of weapons. This was different. He followed the trail until his eyes landed on a device strapped beneath a table, wires snaking out of its core. A digital timer blinked ominously. 10:03, 10:02. Max let out a low bark, activating the tiny microphone strapped to his collar. Jake's voice crackled through the receiver. "What is it, Max? What's wrong?" Realizing he couldn't explain, Max barked again, more urgently this time. Jake turned to the bomb squad, his face pale. "We've got a bomb." The squad's leader shook his head grimly. "Even if we get in now, we don't have time to disarm it." Jake's fist clenched at his side. "Then Max has to handle it." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fear. Jake leaned into the radio. "Max, listen to me. You've got to stay focused. You can do this, buddy." Inside, Max edged closer to the bomb. The faint cries of the hostages reached his ears. He turned his head and saw them, men, women, a child clinging to his mother's neck, tears streaming down his face. Max's gaze softened for a moment before hardening with determination. His mission was clear. The sound of footsteps snapped, him back to the present. One of the robbers was approaching, his eyes scanning the area suspiciously. Max darted into the shadows, his body tense and still. The man stopped just a few feet away, his gaze lingering on the area where Max was hidden. The silence stretched thin, a single breath threatening to give everything away. Finally, the robber moved on, and Max exhaled silently. He crept back toward the bomb, his sharp eyes studying the wires. Outside, Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the radio. "Max, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. Max glanced toward the hostages one last time. The mother was whispering something to her son, her lips trembling, but her voice steady. That sight, love in the face of fear, solidified Max's resolve. With a silent pledge to protect them all, Max moved closer to the bomb, ready to do whatever it took to ensure their safety. The timer ticked down. Row 258, Row 257. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation as the next moments promised either salvation or disaster. The dimly lit corridor smelled of fear and desperation. Max's paws padded silently across the cold floor as his nose twitched, following the faint metallic tang of the bomb. He rounded a corner, and there it was, strapped to a support beam, its timer counting down with unrelenting precision. 0:47, 0:46. Max barked sharply, the sound cutting through the tense air. His collar mic transmitted the bark to Jake and the bomb squad outside. "Max's found it," Jake said, his voice tight. He turned to the squad leader. "We're out of time." "What do we do?" "Not much we can do," the leader replied grimly. "It's up to him now." Inside the building, Max's sharp eyes took in every detail of the bomb. He circled it, barking again, louder this time, to convey the urgency. Suddenly, his ears twitched. A new sound, a low, deliberate voice, reached him. "Don't make me do it," the voice growled, filled with menace. Max followed the sound to another room. The leader of the robbers stood there, gripping a hostage, a young man by the collar. The gun in his hand was pressed firmly to the hostage's temple. "Your bravery doesn't matter now," the leader sneered. "I always win." The hostage whimpered, his legs shaking. Max crouched low, his body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. His sharp eyes locked onto the robber's weapon hand. This wasn't just about courage, it was about timing. The robber laughed, his back to Max. "What a mess this turned out to be. But I'll make sure I leave a mark." Without a sound, Max sprang forward. His powerful jaws clamped down on the robber's wrist, forcing the man to release the gun with a startled shout. The weapon clattered to the floor as the hostage stumbled away, his face pale but alive. "Get off me," the robber screamed, flailing against Max's unyielding grip. The chaos erupted into shouts and gunfire. Max's movements were a blur as he wrestled the man to the ground. The door burst open and officers poured in, their weapons drawn. "Freeze, hands where we can see them." The robber, disarmed and disoriented, raised his hands reluctantly as officers closed in. But Max didn't stop. He bolted back toward the bomb. Time was slipping away and he knew the lives of the hostages were still in danger. Jake stood near the doorway, his heart pounding as he locked eyes with Max. "Max," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. "You know what to do." Max paused for only a moment, staring at Jake. His silent resolve spoke louder than words. Then he turned and gently grabbed the bomb with his jaws, careful not to disturb its fragile wiring. The weight was substantial, but Max moved with purpose, his muscles straining under the load. Smoke filled the corridors as Max sprinted toward an empty wing of the building. Debris littered his path, but his focus was unshaken. The timer continued its relentless countdown. 0:15. Row 14. Max spotted a fireproof container near the end of the hallway. It was dented and dusty, but intact. With one final surge of energy, Max reached the container and placed the bomb inside. His eyes never left the timer as he pushed the lid. Shut with his nose. Row 3. Row 2. A deafening explosion rocked the building. The walls shuddered, sending dust and debris into the air. Outside, the officers shielded their faces as the shockwave hit. "Max!" Jake screamed, his voice breaking. He darted toward the entrance, ignoring the falling plaster and smoke. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, through the haze, a silhouette emerged. Max stumbled into view, his fur singed, his gait unsteady, but his head held high. His eyes met Jake's, and in that moment, the weight of the ordeal melted away. Jake dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Max. "You did it, buddy," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. "You saved them all." The officers erupted into cheers, their voices filling the air with relief and gratitude. Hostages emerged from the building, their faces marked with exhaustion and awe. One young boy broke free from his mother's grip and ran toward Max. "Is he a hero?" he asked, his wide eyes shining with admiration. Jake looked at Max, his voice soft but steady. "He's the bravest hero I've ever known." Max lowered himself to the ground, his body spent, but his spirit unbroken. As the crowd gathered around him, the love and gratitude in their eyes told him everything he needed to know. For Max, it wasn't about recognition or applause. It was about the lives saved and the bonds forged in moments of crisis. Jake knelt beside him, whispering quietly, "You've always been my hero, Max. Always." The street outside the bank buzzed with controlled chaos. Flashing lights painted the darkened street red and blue, while the steady hum of police radios cut through the cold night air. The robbers, now handcuffed and grim-faced, were led to waiting police vans. Their once confident smirks had been replaced by expressions of defeat. "Get them out of my sight," the police captain barked, his voice firm but tinged with relief. Meanwhile, the hostages, wrapped in blankets provided by paramedics, stood in a huddled group. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, but gratitude glimmered in their eyes as they turned to the officers. A woman holding a small child stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Thank you for saving us. And that dog. He's incredible." The captain nodded. "He's more than incredible, he's a hero." In the distance, Jake rushed past the commotion. His eyes darted frantically until they locked on Max. The dog sat near the entrance of the bank, his fur singed, his breathing shallow but steady. Jake dropped to his knees beside him, his hands trembling as they cupped Max's face. "Max." His voice cracked. "You did it, buddy. You saved them all." Max's tail wagged weakly, his eyes bright with recognition. Despite his weariness, he nuzzled Jake's hand, a silent reassurance that he was okay. Tears glistened in Jake's eyes. As he whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without you." A week later, the police department's auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Officers, hostages, and their families filled the room, all gathered to honor Max's heroism. A large banner hung above the stage reading, "Celebrating Bravery," a tribute to Max. Jake stood at the podium, his uniform crisp, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to break through. Max sat beside him, his tail wagging gently, the center of everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, his gaze sweeping over the audience, "today we're here to honor a partner, a protector, and a friend. Max isn't just a police dog. He's a living example of courage, loyalty, and selflessness." Jake paused, his voice softening. "When the odds were against us, Max didn't hesitate. He faced danger head-on, not for recognition, but because he knew lives depended on him. That's the kind of heroism that inspires us all." The audience erupted into applause, some dabbing at their eyes. Jake knelt beside Max, holding a medal engraved with the words, "For valor and service." "You earned this, buddy," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the medal around Max's neck. The crowd rose to their feet, their cheers echoing through the hall. Max barked once, his tail wagging furiously, as if to say, "Thank." Later that evening, Jake and Max returned home. The small house felt warm and welcoming after the chaos of the past week. The soft glow of the fireplace lit the living room, and Max immediately padded over to his favorite spot near the hearth. Jake sank into the armchair, watching as Max curled up, his head resting on his paws. For a moment, neither of them moved, the quiet enveloping them like a blanket. "You've been through so much," Jake murmured, leaning forward to stroke Max's fur. "And you never gave up. Not once." Max let out a soft huff, his eyes half closed, but there was a contentment in his expression. He understood Jake's words, even if they weren't spoken in his language. Over the next few weeks, Max's story spread across the community. Local news stations ran segments celebrating his bravery, and schools invited Jake and Max to speak to students about the bond between humans and animals. At one school, a young girl raised her hand. "Does Max ever get scared?" she asked, her wide eyes fixed on the dog. Jake smiled, glancing at Max, who sat proudly beside him. "Everyone gets scared sometimes," Jake replied. "But what makes Max special is that he doesn't let fear stop him. He trusts me, and I trust him. That's what makes us a team." The children clapped, their faces filled with admiration. Max barked once, his tail wagging as if he understood the praise. One crisp morning, Jake and Max strolled through the park. The medal around Max's neck caught the sunlight, glinting like a badge of honor. People stopped to greet them, some offering a pat on Max's head, others simply nodding in respect. As they walked, Jake glanced down at Max. "You know," he said, his voice soft. "You've taught me so much. About bravery, about loyalty. I'll never take that for granted." Max looked up at Jake, his eyes shining with the unspoken bond they shared. Together they walked on, a man and his dog, partners for life. In the quiet of the park, the world seemed at peace, and for Jake and Max it was another step in their journey, a story of friendship, courage, and the unbreakable bond that made them unstoppable.